Former South Dakota Senator and presidential candidate George McGovern died Sunday at the age of 90. Vice President Joe Biden was among the attendees at Senator McGovern's prayer service in Sioux Falls.
The Lord is the light of my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? Blessed be the Lord, who has heard the voice of my supplications. The Lord is my strength and shield, in whom my heart trusts. Friends, we are gathered this evening to give thanks to God for the gifts of the life of Senator George McGovern. We gather in this place in prayer, asking God to bring God's love and peace to his family and to each one of us who is present in this time of grief and loss. We gather to remember the faithful and committed life who shared his life in friendship with God, caring for his family, serving his country, and touching people's lives in South Dakota and around the world. We gather to open ourselves to God's healing comfort through the gift of prayer, the gift of music, and the gift of story that binds our community together. This time I invite Monsignor James Doyle to open us with prayer.
Let us pray. My brothers and sisters, we believe that all the ties of friendship and affection which knit us together throughout our lives do not unravel with death. Confident that God always hears and remembers the good we have done and forgives any offenses, we pray asking God to gather George McGovern to himself. Lord, in our grief, we turn to you. Are you not the God of love, who opens your ears to all? Listen to our prayers for your servant, George Stanley McGovern, whom you have called out of this world. Lead him to your kingdom of light and peace, and count him amongst the saints in glory. Lord, our Redeemer, you willingly gave yourself up to death so that we might be saved and pass from death to life. We humbly ask you to comfort your servants and handmaids in their grief, and to receive George into the arms of your mercy. You alone, Lord, are the Holy One, and you are mercy itself. By your dying, you unlock the gates of life for those who believe in you. Forgive George any of his sins and grant him a place of happiness, light, and peace in the kingdom of your glory forever and ever. Amen.
The moment we said goodbye, silence tore across the sky. The riverbed lay wide and dry, as far as I could see. And someone said my ghost was found, laying her burden down, taking the long way around underneath the moon. Somewhere on the prairie, a little cross is mine, a simple wooden with a plastic rose entwined. And in the stillness of the twilight, while the tumbleweeds whine, I am crawling like a scorpion across the melancholy time. So shred the poems, let the wild birds chase them in the breeze, let them make their nests from words like please. Put those dreams to rest, throw them at the moon, golden west. I was the fragrance in the wild flowers, opening for only you. In the delicate hour before the cold shot through, 10,000 years from now, you'll put your hand in mine, remembering a fragrance full of melancholy time. See those across these miles of prairie full of melancholy time.
So tonight, I accept your nomination with a full and grateful heart. In Scripture and in the music of our children, we are told to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. And for America, the time has come at last. We are entering a new period of important and hopeful change in America. We must now show that peace and prosperity can exist side by side. Indeed, each now depends on the existence of the other. National strength includes the credibility of our system in the eyes of our own people, as well as the credibility of our deterrent in the eyes of others abroad. National security includes schools for our children, as well as silos for our missiles. It includes the health of our families as much as the size of our bombs, the safety of our streets, and the condition of our cities, and not just the engines of war. And if we someday choke on the pollution of our own air, there will be little consolation in leaving behind a dying continent ringed with steel. So while protecting ourselves abroad, let us form a more perfect union here at home. And this is the time for that task.
The question is, to what standard does the loyal opposition now rally? We do not rally to the support of policies that we deplore. But we do love this country, and we will continue to beckon it to a higher standard. So I ask all of you tonight, stand with your convictions. I ask you not to despair of the political process of this country. The nation will be better because we never once gave up the long battle to renew its oldest ideals and to redirect its current energies along more humane and hopeful paths. So let us play the proper role of the loyal opposition, and let us play it in those familiar words from Isaiah that I've quoted so frequently. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. God bless you. Good night.
Thank you all for being here. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the incredible music of East of Westreville. This is one of George McGovern's favorite bands. He talked about these folks all the time, the Bondies, Kaya and Brian, Boyd Bristow, Al Slaughthog, and of course Kenny Putnam. Thank you all so much for your incredible gift of music to this ceremony. Mr. Vice President, on behalf of the McGovern family and on behalf of the broader family of South Dakota, thank you Thank you for being here and showing your respect for our native son. About 3 weeks ago, I had the privilege, as I've had routinely for the last few years, to enjoy a meal with my friend George McGovern. And I tell you this story by way of an introduction of Bob Duffett, who's going to be the speaker next from Dakota Wesleyan, the president of Dakota Wesleyan University. I went to lunch with Senator McGovern, and we started talking about his flights in the B-24, the Liberator, the Dakota Queen, named for Eleanor. And of course, he flew 35 missions. The only reason he only flew 35 missions is because the war ended. He would have flown more. But he flew 35 missions in a number of different planes, and he named them all the Dakota Queen in honor of Eleanor. He flew lots of different airplanes, but always they had the same name in honor of Eleanor. And I said to him, I have an idea. Let's find the Dakota Queen, restore it and bring it back and put it in front of the George and Eleanor McGovern Library at Dakota Wesleyan. What a great attraction that would be. And he smiled and he looked at me and he said, I have a story to tell you. And whenever George McGovern said that, you just sat back and loved it. And here's his story. He said at the end of the war, after 35 missions, he had been instructed to patch the latest plane that he had flown, the latest Dakota Queen, fill in the bullet holes, fill in the shrapnel, and fly it back in as pristine condition as he could manage. And so he did that, and he flew it back to the United States. And then he went back to Mitchell, and he started to teach at Dakota Wesleyan and didn't think much again about the Dakota Queen. And one night, he and Eleanor went to the movie at the State Theater in Mitchell, South Dakota, and they sat in the fifth row. And you remember movies then had a newsreel preceding the main feature. Well, this newsreel was about what happened to those bombers in World War II after they came back. Specifically, the B-24 is known as the Liberators. And he and Eleanor sat in the fifth row of the State Theater and looked up at the screen as they watched and learned that there's a place called a boneyard outside of Tucson where these airplanes went after they'd been crushed. And he looked up at the newsreel, and there the nose of the Dakota Queen came up as it was being crushed. And he stopped and he turned to me and he said, Heidi, I believe I can locate the Queen, but she's not prepared for display. Bob Duffett, the president of Dakota Wesleyan University, George McGovern's alma mater, the place where he went to teach, the place where his library is located, Bob Duffett was at his bedside, I think, every single time I went to see George McGovern. Bob Duffett was there, boosting his spirits, making him feel positive about the future, giving him reason to hope. Bob Duffett is a great leader, not only for George McGovern's institution, but for all of South Dakota, and I'm delighted to present him to you. Bob, would you share with us your remembrances?
Dakota Wesleyan University, the city of Mitchell, all of you and the state of South Dakota lost a dear friend. George McGovern, age 90, DWU class of 1946, died early Sunday morning, October 21st, this past week. As a congressman, as a senator, and the Democratic candidate for the American presidency in 1972, he gained international fame. As I view his life, three talents, all grounded in the soil of South Dakota, may account for his meteoric rise. First, George was an exceedingly bright man. This was a gift of birth. Yet, he developed this gift by reading and writing, two habits that sharpen the intellect. He wrote books and articles and speeches almost to the very last day of his life. What nature gave, George developed. Now, by his own admission, George was very shy, not the type of person attracted to debate or politics. Yet through the one, he found the other. A teacher at Mitchell High School suggested that this painfully shy boy join the extroverted debate team. He flourished, continued debate at Dakota Wesleyan University as a student, and became a nationally renowned college debater. Later, as professor of history at DW, he was our debate coach as well. Love of history is his third talent. And from my perspective, this was George's best talent. It set him apart from almost every other politician. He knew instinctively that any contemporary political problem, issue, or crisis had a trail of past events or factors. For instance, George was no pacifist. He knew evil exists, and war sometimes is the only way to counter it. He was a legitimate hero of what Studs Terkel called the good war. He was against the war in Vietnam because the Vietnamese, like Americans in 1976, sought independence and autonomy. His study of history gave him this penetrating and prophetic insight. Last, it was his religious faith that brought together these three talents. The Wesleyan Methodist Church of his father, the Reverend Joseph McGovern, called people to personal faith and then activated them to do something useful in the world. For George, the useful part derived from the universal moral imperatives from the Sunday school lessons and stories he learned as a youth, like feed the hungry, clothe the naked, learn war no more. Due to the emotional excesses of zealous believers, George carried a lifelong reticence about personal faith. But like the Old Testament prophet of old, he lifted our moral vision and summoned society to a higher ethical plane. Now, some say George was the greatest humanitarian and peacemaker of our era. This is why we at DWU honor him by naming our library, Center for Leadership and Public Service, and a museum for him. It all began here in South Dakota. Yet, his impact had a worldwide involvement. Jesus' words may best be a fitting epitaph for his life. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. They are the sons of God.
On behalf of the McGovern family, I'd like to thank the Honor Guard, members of the City of Sioux Falls, the South Dakota Highway Patrol, the South Dakota Air National Guard, for the respect that they paid to one of our beloved veterans of World War II this evening. The one thing we know is that George McGovern always knew, from his days wearing the country's uniform to those early party building efforts, all the way through to just a few weeks ago at the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra. George always knew it wasn't about him. We might have thought it was about him. We were drawn to him, but he always knew it wasn't about him. It was about the causes that brought people together, people of great talent and energy and passion to commit themselves to making a difference, to improving the human condition. And he knew that it spanned across many generations of many families across South Dakota and the country. It certainly did in mine. It certainly did in a lot of the families that I see here this evening. And it was always such a blessing to feel that you were part of this legacy, and he made you feel that way. And I see that our vice president is joined by his son Hunter Biden this evening. And when I see my contemporaries like Hunter, who's now chairman of the World Food Program USA, or Dr. Raj Shah, who's heading up the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I'm sure each of us will always cherish the one-on-one times we had with George McGovern, in person or on the phone, when we got our pep talks and we got to hear that sense of humor as he weaved those stories to share his wisdom, to share his experience, to inspire those of us and hunters in my generation to seize opportunities to make a difference, to alleviate hunger and malnutrition. And then those from that 72 campaign, my goodness, across the state, across the country, this raw brain power that was drawn to be a part of that campaign, each of whom had a chance to get to know the McGovern family, to know who George McGovern was, what he stood for. And as my good friend, colleague Marshall Matz would say, he gave so many of us these Ivy League credentials to go out and do good in the world. And so it was, whether it was directly for those of us blessed to have gotten the inspiration, the words of wisdom directly from George McGovern, or for those like Marshall, or the individual I'm going to introduce here in a moment. They were empowered through those experiences and the understanding of what brought us together to share with the next generation. And George knows that those of us from my generation and younger who knew him, who were inspired by him, have an obligation to keep doing the same, because that's the legacy of this great man that will endure. We're so pleased that this evening, someone who has done just that, made sure that a legacy of a commitment to civil rights and to standing up for social justice, and doing it throughout the course of his lifetime and still does it today, who served as the National Finance Director for the 1972 campaign, doing through direct mail what we're now doing through YouTube and the internet and the new technology of the day in campaigns of communicating effectively and fundraising through direct mail, but then taking that experience to make a difference, as I said, as an advocate for civil rights and social justice. I would invite Mr. Morris Dees, founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, to share his remembrance.
Thank you so much. The kind words. It's something that I didn't do by myself. I did it with the help of George McGovern in a big way. He was a spokesperson for the Southern Poverty Law Center for over 40 years. Tonight and tomorrow, you'll hear a lot about Senator McGovern, our dear friend George. But I want to talk to you about what made me spend 1 year working for him in 1972. The thing I think that will go down is his legacy. It was his fight against the war in Vietnam. George McGovern spoke truth to power. He probably made one of the most courageous speeches any United States senator and maybe any politician ever made in 1970 in the well of the United States Senate. And I just want to read you a couple of words from that speech. He said, "Every senator in this chamber is partially responsible for sending 50,000 Americans to the grave. This chamber reeks of blood. Every senator here is partially responsible for that human wreckage at Walter Reed and Bethesda and across our nation and our land. Young men without legs or arms or genitals or faces or hope." And after he made that speech, several senators approached him angrily and said, "You personally offended us." And he said, "I intended to." George McGovern was not the loser of that 1972 election. The American people were the loser because we did not heed his message. When Barack Obama was elected, the first thing Senator McGovern did was urge him to immediately end the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he did not heed that message. The last book that Senator McGovern wrote was What It Means to Be a Democrat. I'll always treasure the inscription in the book to my wife, Susan, and I. Came to our house, and about 200 people gathered when he talked about his book. Any book that should be required reading. And Joe, I see you nodding your head out there. He said, "This is the time for us to heal our nation's rift and to deliver on her promises as we see it, a republic that is good to all." He said, "It is not for nothing that I go to my grave believing that our country is one of the greatest countries on earth." He did something very unusual. He invited millions of Americans to make small contributions to his campaign, the first time that ever been done in the history of the country, because no wealthy donors would support him. Why go for $25 and get $50,000? And I had the honor of being his finance chairman or fundraiser. My dear friend Jeff Smith over here and I worked hard getting those letters out. And on the first page, at the ending of that letter, which he incorporated, he said, and he turned to the scriptures, and it's appropriate in this house of worship. It's in the ancient words of Ecclesiastes, "To everything there's a season, and to every purpose unto the heavens." I believe this is the time to heal, a time to build up, a time to cast away the stones of war and gather the stones for building. It is a time to speak, not hate, a time for peace. I got a call to come to St. Augustine, Florida, because they said George might not live much longer. And this has been about 3 months ago, and Jeff Smith and I went down, and he was vibrant, and he took us out to dinner. And as we stood at the door going away, he said, "Boys, I'm going to live to be 100. I got 10 more years because I got a lot of things to do." Well, George, it's a time for you to now rest, because we will heed your message. And to paraphrase Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, and I'm not the first time to do this, for when an American lost a great leader, Bobby Kennedy did this also at his eulogy for his brother. And I'll paraphrase Shakespeare, and maybe he'll forgive me. It says, I pray that the angels shall take you, George McGovern, and cut you up into little stars, and sprinkle you in the heavens so that the world will be in love with the night. Amen.
George McGovern may have been the most modest and gracious human being that any of us have ever known. He and Jim Abner had an interest in two things. One is politics and the other is baseball. Jim Abner coached the Legion team in Kennebec, and George McGovern loved the St. Louis Cardinals tremendously. His father had played in the farm system for the St. Louis Cardinals. George McGovern lost two races later in his life, the race for the presidency against Richard Nixon, and then in 1980, the race for the United States Senate against Jim Abner. I began by telling you that he is probably the most gracious and modest person any of us have ever known, and that is true. He got a lot of attention. In fact, Bob Dole wrote a letter to the New York Times in the wake of his passing talking about the fact that George McGovern attended Pat Nixon's funeral, and no one was more surprised than Richard Nixon when George McGovern showed up. But what a lot of people don't know is George McGovern's passion for baseball also involved going to our own minor league team, the Canaries, now known as the Pheasants. And as Matt McGovern will tell you, when he would drive his grandpa to the Canaries games, George would say, "Let's go by Dow Rummel Village." You know who he picked up? Jim Abner, the guy who beat him in his race for a fourth term in the United States Senate. Jim Abner, this gracious, humble giant of a man, insisted that they pick him up and take him to the baseball game. Not once, but several times. And they would sit there together and enjoy baseball, a common love. Two giants of the prairie. Matthew, I love to hear you tell that story. It's just so wonderful. And think about that in today's polarized politics. How does someone like that even come to be? What a tremendous example. And he set an example for other leaders in the prairie. Leaders like our own Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, Senator Jim Abourezk, who served with him at the same time in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey, later Vice President of the United States, a South Dakotan we claim. All really mastered the art of leadership, of standing tall. But it didn't just extend to elected leaders. If you look at the senior staff, and the Vice President will be the first to attest to that, South Dakotans in the White House, working right now for the President of the United States and the Vice President, and those who have been involved in campaigns. And it's my privilege to introduce one of the real giants of that trade. Hildy, Steve Hildebrandt, was not only the 2000 Iowa chairman for the Gore campaign, but the deputy national campaign manager for the Obama-Biden campaign. He is really a giant in this profession and has been such a stalwart for the McGovern family throughout all of this time. I now ask Hildy to come on up and visit with us.
Ann and Susan, I am so humbled to be here, and this is going to be hard. I will never forget your invitation to join your family at the hospice facility, to be there next to my hero. He's all our hero. My family is like millions of American families and probably millions of families all over the world that we don't even know, who needed George McGovern's advocacy to make it to the middle class. I grew up the youngest of 9 kids. My father died when I was 5, leaving 7 of us kids at home. It was never talked about around the dinner table that you're a Democrat. You just knew you were a Democrat. We were Democrats because the Democrats fought for us. It was George McGovern and his advocacy for programs like Pell Grants, student loans, that allowed my family to go to school. It was Social Security and Medicare that helped my mother along the way. When I was 10, I remember my mom taking us down in front of the Corn Palace for a McGovern for President rally. and I got to shake his hand. And that's where it all started. When I was 18, graduating from high school and heading up to South Dakota State, George was in that last race for the U.S. Senate. And that loss is what solidified it for me. I was never going to put my life on hold and not help candidates who were going to fight for people like my family. That was a tough race. It was a tough loss. But it made the decision for me to go advocate for people like George McGovern. And what an honor I've had for 26 years working for Tom Daschle and Tim Johnson and Skip Humphrey and Al Gore and Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama. George McGovern paved the way for this. There's a couple of us that once in a while get in trouble in this room for speaking a little more than we probably should. I'm one of them. What George McGovern taught me more than anything else was you speak your mind. More politicians on both sides should learn more from George McGovern. He taught us that you work hard and you work together to get things done. His advocacy with Bob Dole and so many others got things accomplished in this country, and we're not there anymore. There's a song that I listen to constantly, probably more than I should. I listen to it over and over again, but there's a line in it about joy and renewal. And that's really what I get out of George McGovern. I get a tremendous amount of joy, the personal time together, the stories. He never stopped advocating for Main Street in Mitchell. He'd come into my restaurant, and there he was. He would say, "Steve, that's our hometown. What are we going to do about Mitchell? We got to fix up that Main Street." But renewal. This is such a great time for renewal. We can look at things a little bit better, a little bit differently by reflecting on his life and everything he advocated for. And all day long today, people have come through this church. Modest people, famous people. It didn't really matter. They would stop and they would tell their stories about George McGovern. This guy, at 90, never stopped. He never stopped helping, advocating, writing, speaking. What an amazing, amazing person. And I am just so proud to be a friend of his and to have a chance to be so close friends with Ann and Susan and the other members of the family. So, thank you.
George so loved Eleanor. We all have been privileged to hear the stories that George would share over the years about Eleanor. So many of his stories, he would weave in the wisdom, the care, the love that Eleanor shared with him, with their children, with their grandchildren. George McGovern knew the importance of having strong women on your side. When George was out there, grassroots, building the Democratic Party in South Dakota, articulating a vision about the importance of two parties, putting ideas on the table for voters to evaluate, he inspired so many, but boy, this dynamic group of women in South Dakota who knew what it took to implement that vision, to build the foundation, the infrastructure, to get the job done. And boy, to introduce our next guest to share a remembrance, stories about her precede her because of the type of anchor she is. Someone who knows what needs to be done and efficiently goes about getting the job done in a caring, compassionate, reliable, understanding way. Someone who was part of pioneering that party building that was so essential in our state, that worked side by side with George McGovern and his family and continued to be such a close friend and part of that family and a confidant, and someone we know as a matriarch of the South Dakota Democratic Party, particularly here in Sioux Falls and in Minnehaha County. Bernice Mayer, could you come up and share your remembrance?
I used to have to do this for Eleanor. Anne and Susan, thank you for the honor of being a part of this evening as we remember your father, George McGovern. There were times we took your father away from you. Sometimes we took your father and your mother. And sometimes we needed to meld ourselves as unobtrusively as possible with your family. To you, he was your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and a sister-in-law. To the rest of the world, he was an inspirational, dedicated, and honest public official. There are more than 20 former Senate staff members and countless campaign staff gathered here tonight and tomorrow. Most of us has worked as volunteers for the Democrats before we became staff members. We did this because we believed in the senator's vision, we admired his courage, and most of all, we cared about the same kind of people he did. We shared a common interest in public issues, in expressing them to the public, and in helping promote the candidacy of the person we respected and loved. Now, in November of 1963, I attended the convention of the National Association of Mental Health in Washington, D.C. Our group met with the junior senator for South Dakota, George McGovern. He hosted us for lunch in the Senate dining room. Halfway through the meal, a signal was sent for all the senators to report to the floor. That date was November 22nd, 1963, the day that John Kennedy was shot. Shortly thereafter, I received a letter from Petter and Dorothy Ecker, local Democrats, inviting me to talk about issues and how to address them. I remember Bill Doherty telling me if I wanted to promote my issues, I needed to find a candidate to promote them and then get the votes to elect them. Of course, Bill was right. My political activity began in 1964 as the secretary of the local county Democratic Party. In 1965, a gathering of local Democrats met at the home of Bill Doherty. At that time, federal office holders were allowed to participate in partisan politics. The group included Judge Francis Dunn, Judge Fred Nickel, both of whom had been appointed by President Kennedy. Another member was Mike Shermer, who served as the first campaign chairman for George McGovern in 1956. He was later elected the mayor of Sioux Falls. Now, much of the heavy lifting of the McGovern office was done by George Cunningham, his chief of staff. His son Christopher is here with us tonight. Judy Harrington, his state director, arrived in Sioux Falls in February of 1973. She set up constituent field offices in 6 cities: Sioux Falls, Rapid City, Aberdeen, Huron, Mitchell, and Pierre. 1 person per office. In those days, we shared an office with the staff of Senator Jim Abarisk. I went to work on the Senate staff in 1975. I was privileged to be a member of the state staff, and it was always special when the senator was back in state. He enjoyed driving my Buick Regal, speeding down the road, smoking a cigar with the window down. A typical day was spent going to Scotland to visit the Broyan gasohol plant. It was the beginning of now widely known Poet ethanol. We then drove north on Highway 37. About 10 miles south of Tripp, he told me he was short of cash. This was before credit cards and ATM machines. So we stopped at the bank in Parkston. He filled out a counter check, and the banker gave him the money. We motored on to Mitchell, where his family was waiting at their lake home. At another time, Ralph Morse, who was the president of the local Trades and Labor Assembly, stopped at the office to arrange a speaking engagement with the senator. Ralph stopped by often to drink coffee and chat. He looked out the window and he saw my car, a red Honda. It was parked in the parking lot. He told me I could not bring the senator to the Labor Temple in a foreign car. I could not park in their parking lot. I assured him we would not, that we would park on Fairfax Avenue, out on the street, which we did. This year in August, we had a gathering to celebrate the senator's 90th birthday at Steve Hildebrand's place. I told the senator I came to his 90th birthday party because he had come to my 80th birthday party last year. His quick response was that he would come to my 90th birthday, and he invited me to come to his 100th birthday. Now, I was privileged to spend time with him and his family the last 5 days of his life at Doherty Hospice House. The first morning, a man in working clothes entered the visitor area. He introduced himself. He told us he was the man who handled his luggage at the airport. He came to pay his respects. I saw the flowers and the letters that came. Envelopes addressed to the Honorable, to the Senator, to Mr., and others just plain to George. Postmarks were from Edgemont, Plankington, Vermilion, South Dakota, Washington, D.C., Arizona, California, Colorado, Iowa. Some cards, but mostly were handwritten letters. Of special interest to me was the back of an envelope. Someone drew a big red heart with the message, "From your waitress at Minerva's." This was the face of those who called him their senator. These were his people. May he rest in peace.
We are going to sing together the song that Ann told me a couple days ago was the song that George McGovern thought should be our national anthem. If you'll pick up your hymnal and turn to page 696 and stand, and we will sing America the Beautiful.
For
Senator McGovern held elective office serving the state of South Dakota for 22 years against some pretty strong odds in those early races, and then gaining the trust of his constituents to win by larger margins in those Senate races, the 60s and 70s. And we know that in the middle of that career in elective office, it's one of the most tumultuous times in our country's history in the late 60s and early 70s. And all of us have men in our lives who came of age during that time, on college campuses, in the jungles of Vietnam. And they share stories with us about that time. The uncertainties that they were experiencing as 18, 19, 20-year-olds. My father and stepfather came of age during that time. My husband came of age during that time. And two other great public servants for the state of South Dakota came of age during that time. And both of them followed Senator McGovern's footsteps to serve over 20 years in elective office. Senator Daschle and Senator Johnson. Both of them, during their years in public life, have made some of the same commitments to agriculture, to working families, to veterans. And we've learned a lot from both of them. We've benefited from their service. Someone who came of age during that time and whose own son then served in one of our more modern wars, who I had the honor of learning from as an intern in his office in the U.S. House of Representatives when I was a student at Georgetown University. A hero of mine, someone who has the same statesman-like qualities as Senator McGovern, and the decency, the humility that marks the type of leadership that great South Dakotans take to the nation's capital. I'd like to welcome Senator Tim Johnson to share his remembrance.
Thank you, Stephanie. Tonight, we're here to celebrate the life of George McGovern, a man that many of us call friend, and a small group call grandpa, dad, uncle, brother, or cousins, members of his family. To all of the family, members who have loved him so deeply, and yet shared him with South Dakota and the world, thank you. Know that you are all in our hearts and prayers. When I think of George, I think of a man of uncompromising integrity who dedicated his life to serving our state and our country. As I read numerous reflections printed this week, I realize that this is a universal memory. Even his 90th birthday was a gift to us through his masterful performance of Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait with the South Dakota Symphony just 2 weeks ago. He was one of the last people to leave the auditorium that night. As he took time to shake hands and talk with his many friends and supporters. Although physically frail, his love for people was as great as ever. Like my mother, George was a PK, a preacher's kid. And I recall from my mother's memories that it wasn't easy all the time. George often talked about growing up not only as a Methodist PK who couldn't attend movies, but also as a child of the Depression, living in a small parsonage that shared the little they had with those in the congregation who had even less. This background provided the foundation for his deep sense of morality and social justice. It was a force that led him to be a lifelong advocate for feeding the hungry. For certain, the cause of freedom as a World War II bomber pilot, and then after seeing the devastation of war, he returned home to spend the rest of his life working for peaceful solutions to international conflicts. George once said that politics is an act of faith, meaning that you need faith that the people can make a good decision and moral decision. George had that faith, and his life of moral and intellectual leadership has made it easier for all of us to carry that faith forward. Although he was one of the most prominent leaders of the Democratic Party, one of the features that I most admired in George was his belief that good and moral decisions extended to leaders in both parties and led to his lifelong friendships with statesmen like Bob Dole, with whom he formed a deep friendship as he worked on hunger issues, and with the conservative commentator William Buckley, with whom he delighted in debating the issues of the 90s, whether in public, on nationally televised firing line, or over a drink as they traveled together debating their opposing views on college campuses. In one of our last conversations, he talked of his profound sadness that today's leaders have forgotten too often the importance of respect, cooperation, and compromise so essential for the survival of our democracy. With all of his accomplishments, perhaps his greatest was his marriage to Eleanor. I will never forget the opening of the McGovern Library, which Eleanor was too weak to attend, and how affectionately he touched the newly unveiled statue of her standing with him as they stood together throughout their lives. We can rejoice today that they are now reunited, and with two of their 5 children, Terry and Steve, they lived the lives that John Wesley, our great Methodist leader, admonished them when he said, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." I now have the honor of introducing another national leader that I deeply respect, a man who also drew inspiration from the life of his close friend, George McGovern, our Vice President, Joe Biden.
Tim, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Ann and Susie, and to all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and in-laws. I feel like an interloper in a sense. You all had such an intimate relationship with George for so many years here in South Dakota. But I have to tell you that Hunter and I, my son and I, are genuinely honored to be here. Several of you said to me, you're in the middle of a campaign, how can you be here? Where I come from, the question is, how could you not be here? How could you not be here for a man that did so much for so many people? You know, and it's also an honor to be here with my colleagues. Jim Abresk, you crazy son of a gun. I love you. I love that guy. Jim and I served together. We became friends right away because we're both a little nuts. We say what's on our mind, Jim. I haven't learned not to. I don't know what's the matter, Jim. And Tom Daschle, no one I respected more in all the years I've worked in the United States Senate. And Tim, your courage, God love you, as my mother would say. You've got such incredible courage and character. And Stephanie, thanks for helping get Hunter through Georgetown. You really screwed him up. He then went to Yale, which really bothered me a lot, quite frankly. And Hildy, it's good to see you, old buddy. You're still in there punching, and thanks for the help. 1980 was a tough year, a real tough year. 1980, we lost Gaylord Nelson, we lost Birch Bayh, we lost Frank Church, we lost George McGovern, we lost the heart, soul, and spine of the United States Senate that I had joined. And the speech you heard George giving, I remember like you do, but maybe from a different perspective. I was a 29-year-old kid. I was the Senate nominee from the state of Delaware at my first convention, and sitting there mesmerized by the man who was speaking, as I remember it, much too late in the night, but speaking. I ran with your father, Susie and Ann, in 1972. When I got elected, I wasn't old enough to serve. I literally got elected when I was 29. I had to wait to be constitutionally eligible to be sworn in. But I not only served with your father in the Senate from 1972 to 1980, I kept contact with your father, and to my great good fortune, he kept contact with me. And I admired him from the day I became aware of him to the day he died. His phrase in his speech, "We do love this country." I don't know anybody who loved this country more than George McGovern. When I tried to get the presidential nomination, and I wasn't as successful as he was, in 1988, I used to end my speeches sort of cribbing in the same style from the George McGovern speech in 1972, but with a different phrase. The Monsignor will recognize it as a communion hymn in the Roman Catholic Church. As he will raise you up on eagle's wings and bear you on the breath of dawn and make the sun to shine upon you. That was my notion of the country and the obligation we had that I learned from George McGovern. Our function in public life was to raise people up on eagle's wings, bear them on the breath of dawn, and let the sun shine upon them. Because if we did, the one thing I shared from my family upbringing with George McGovern was I had never had a doubt, and Jim Aberesk, I'm more optimistic today than when you and I got elected. I never had a doubt, and do not now. You just shed a little light on the dark corners of this country. The American people respond. They are capable of anything, given a half a chance. That's maybe what Morris Dees and I, and Jeff Smith. Jeff, I haven't seen you in a long while, buddy. But Morris Dees and I were attracted to George McGovern for the same reason. I got involved in public life in my state as a kid because my state was segregated by law, the state of Delaware. And I got involved in the civil rights movement, and I was no Congressman Lewis. I was not at the bridge at Selma, but I was picketing and marching to desegregate our movie theaters and working on the east side of my city. And no great shakes as a high school and college kid, but it was Bull Connor's dogs and George McGovern's call to justice to end the war in Vietnam were the two things that shaped my political how can I say it? My political sensibilities more than anything before or since. And Morris, you quoted from the speech I was going to mention, but I'll leave you with that end line. He said, I'm fed up to my ears with old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in. He not only spoke for our generation, Morris, he spoke for our soul. And I still feel the same way. I still feel the same way. And I marvel at the courage. Every time, and it's not that often, but every time an event or a historical footnote reminds you of that moment, that speech, I think, as Tom and Jim and anyone who served in the House or Senate can tell you, particularly in the Senate, what incredible political courage and gumption it took to make that speech on the floor of the Senate. The only thing I share differently than my friends who served is I suffered from having served there longer than all but 13 people in American history. Isn't that a hell of an indictment? Excuse me. Which means the reason I mention it is I was there for 36 years. And you have no idea sort of the institutional, unintended but intended pressure that everything from the walls to the marble to the ceiling bring upon those of us who serve there. To try to, the hardest thing to do is to actually confront that body of women and men when they are out of line. It takes remarkable political courage. Tom, can you imagine anyone doing that with that? And I think to myself, and I remember as a kid, as a young man, the phrase, "This chamber reeks with blood." The only speech I ever heard that came close to that was a speech by an Iowan, Senator Hughes, who was Harold Hughes has made a speech on capital punishment, which was of a similarly profound. And I always thought to myself, if I ever got there, and I wasn't thinking it at the time, but as I ran, I hope and pray I'd have that kind of courage. But I tell you what courage I did draw from George McGovern. I come from a family not like most of you, I suspect. Typical middle-class family, 3 bedrooms, 4 kids, a relative living with you all the time. For real. Grandmom dies, grandpop moves in, aunts, uncles, you know what I mean? It was actually great for the kids. Probably hard for mom and dad. But, and the joke used to be, I'm the first United States Senator I ever knew. But it literally is true until I ran. I'm the first, other than my opponent, I'm the first United States Senator I ever knew in my family. And so I don't come from there's no Horatio Alger story, but just a typical American story. And people say to me now, and I wonder now, whatever gave you the courage as a 29-year-old kid to announce for the United States Senate against a man who had an 82% favorable rating in a year when we knew it was going to be tough, and Senator McGovern knew it was going to be tough. My state then, Tom, was solidly red. We didn't call it red then, but it was overwhelmingly Republican. What gave you the courage to run? Or some thought, what made you so foolhardy? The answer, and you girls should know this, was your father. Your father. I didn't know him when I announced for the Senate, but I honest to God believed that I could maybe go help him end this war. I honest to God believed that. And what an incredible privilege it was to serve with him. I remember in what Frank Church and Hubert Humphrey at the time, I was on the Foreign Relations Committee. I was a young kid on the Foreign Relations Committee. Served with your dad. And we got a notice that Dr. Kissinger was coming to an executive session, Secretary of State. That meant a private session. Before we had 407, Tom, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a very ornate room with a big conference table, looks like a table in the Oval Office, in the cabinet room. And he came to testify and tell us about how we're going to end the war. This was 1974, beginning of 74. And he went on and he spoke, and he didn't say anything. And everyone thanked him. Your father was by this time kind of just fed up, and he left, and we had a committee meeting, and I said, Democrats and Republicans, I said, but he didn't say anything. And they said, well, he didn't. And I said, we should ask, so how smart I was, Tim. I said, we should have the president come up and tell us. I'm going to tell the president to come to the Foreign Relations Committee. And I'll never forget, Jack Javits walked over to the phone, Senator Javits, and picked up the phone and called down and arranged that afternoon for us to go down to meet with the president, with Gerald Ford, Kissinger, and the whole team with the committee. And as we're walking in, your father turned to me and said, I like you. I'll never forget. And the irony of all ironies is, I'm taking too much of your time, I apologize. The irony of all ironies is, the chair I sit in now as Vice President of the United States is a chair that's directly across from the President. The President sits in the middle of that conference table. facing inward, and I sit in the middle facing toward the Rose Garden. But based on seniority, you get seated when you attend a cabinet meeting, if it's not the cabinet itself. And the most junior member sits where the vice president sits. So I was sitting there, and everyone asked their questions. And again, your dad was so fed up, he didn't really ask anything. Everybody knew. And it got to me, and I remember, I'll never forget how nervous I was. And I looked at President Ford and I said, trying to be very proper, I said, begging the president's pardon, but I'm sure if the president were in my position, the president would ask the president the following question. Swear to God, it's in the transcript. And Ford looked at me very graciously and said, yeah. I said, with all due respect, Mr. President, you haven't told us anything. Remember, Jim, they're talking about Sector 1, Sector 2, Sector 3. And with that, the president turned and said, Henry, tell them. And that was the first time it was decided that we were not going to try to sustain our presence. And it was about 5 weeks later, helicopters were taking off the roof. Not because of me, that was the plan. But the point was, I remember walking out of there thinking, I was right. I got to go to Washington and be with George McGovern and play a little tiny part in ending that war. And what people don't realize, had your father not been there, had your father never been in the Senate, so much more blood, so much more treasure would have been wasted. The war would have never ended when it did. It would have never ended how it did. Your father gave courage to people who didn't have the courage to speak up, to finally stand up. Your father stood there and took all of that beating. Your father, who was characterized by these right-wing guys as a coward and unwilling to fight, your father was a genuine hero. The irony used to make me so angry that your father would never speak up and talk about his heroism. The Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak clusters. Your father had more courage, and physical courage, his little finger. And 95% of those guys who continued to fight a war we shouldn't have fought in the first place. But because he took such a miserable beating, he actually, even though he didn't win that election, he won the end of the war. It would have never happened. And the other thing your father did, which will not goes unspoken to. Your father, his egalitarian sense of fairness, his instinct for decency, transformed my party, unrelated to the war, opened it to women, young people, minorities. He is the father of the modern Democratic Party. Your father is the father of the modern Democratic Party. And that's a fact. That is a fact. The party I'm proud to be a member of. I was determined not to become emotional about this. And I had more to say here, but I'll skip it. Let me just end by saying this. My dad would say, we're here to all the McGoverns with McGovern blood. My dad had a great expression. He'd look at you all and he'd say, you have got good blood, kid. You've got good blood. Just remember, whenever you're down, think of literally the hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today because of your father His lesson he brought back from war. Everybody else brought back different lessons. But your father brought back the lesson of seeing Italian women and children scourging through garbage pails, and decided he was going to make part of his life to end hunger in the world. And Monsignor, you said that you hope in death there is a thread of connection that continues to tie us. As we used to say in the Senate, please excuse a point of personal privilege, but I feel like my family's still tethered to you guys through my son Hunter. My son Hunter knew your dad when he was a kid. He was a little boy when I got elected. But he had the great good fortune of knowing your dad, not only as a child, but being able to work with your dad, being able to learn with your dad as an adult. Today, as Stephanie said, Hunter's the chairman of an organization that exists only because of your father, to fight hunger, feeding hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world, and teaching them how to feed themselves. The World Food Program USA is your dad's. And I can't tell you how proud I am of my son, that he's now chairman, but proud because that thread, the same thing that brought me into politics, connects my son to your dad, and in turn, my son to you, Matt. The idea your grandfather must have been smiling knowing that my son is holding a fundraiser for you. Held a fundraiser for you. I know this sounds corny, but I can't tell you how much joy that gives me. It makes me believe, which we Irish Catholics believe, that there is that thread, Monsignor. It does run. It runs through it. So folks, George McGovern did what probably no more than two handful of men or women have ever done in the history of this country. He summoned to public life. He inspired a whole generation, not figuratively, literally, a whole generation of leaders to get engaged in the 60s. Many in this room tonight, and so many in Washington and the capitals all over this country, people who serve with passion, conscience, conviction, and they literally, not figuratively, got started because George McGovern had the courage, as a friend of mine in the east side of Wilmington used to say, Earl Larkin, to stand up and holler. Stand up and holler for justice. And he summoned thousands of people who are in turn now summoning new people. Think about it, all kidding aside. Think about it. Name me more than a handful of other women or men in American public life who've had such a generational impact. It was a great honor to serve with your dad. It was a great honor to know your dad. And it was a great compliment when Matt told me his grandpop watched my debate with Paul Ryan and said, I want to call Joe. I appreciate it, Matt. It means a lot. As maybe one of only two Irish Catholics in this church, I'll have to rely on you to testify what I'm about to say, Monsignor, to be true. The highest compliment Irish Catholic can give to another man or woman, literally, my grandpa Finnegan used to say, is a compliment I want to pay to your dad. George McGovern was a good and decent man.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you again so much for honoring us with your presence. It's a privilege now to introduce some of that good blood, my friend, Matt McGovern.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and I'm just going to tell a couple stories about Grandpa George. And you know, we've all heard the great job titles that he always had from the other speakers and the Senate and Congress, but we always called him Grandpa George. And I was asked earlier this week, someone asked me, what are your earliest memories of your grandfather? And to me, thinking back to just being a tiny little kid, I think about that big smile on his face when we would come to the door to visit him at his house in Washington, D.C., and he would greet us with a big hug and a big smile, and he'd say, "Well, look who's here." And he would just make us feel great. And I see everyone else laughing along in the front row because they know what I'm talking about. And this picture actually is one of my favorite pictures of my grandma and grandpa, and they're looking down at my cousin Tim when he was a little kid back in 1972, and you can see the smile and the warmth that came from the both of them. So I would say, you know, I feel lucky to be part of this family, even if he had never done anything that got mentioned in the newspaper or on TV, just because of the kind of people that my grandma and grandpa were and my parents are. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to have him here for 90 years. I had friends in elementary school who didn't have any of their grandchildren at all, and I was lucky to have grandparents well into my 20s, 30s, now 40, losing my last one. And of course we miss them, but I feel lucky to have had them around this long. And you know, we'd go visit every year at Christmas, and he'd come visit us, and we'd go out at least a couple other times during the year. So there was a lot of fun memories, of course, and I remember a lot from the 1980 Senate race, because we traveled around the whole state with the family in a Ford Econoline van, just going to every campaign rally and the fairs and rodeos and things like that. And I know it didn't work out the way we would have liked, but to me it was still a great year. It was a great adventure to be with my grandpa that way. And there were a lot of times where it would just be my grandpa and me driving in a car somewhere. He'd be driving, and I'd be sitting in the car with him. And it seemed, now that I'm older and I've worked on other people's campaigns and worked on big campaigns, it doesn't always work that way. A lot of times there's a big entourage and a lot of staff and things like that. But a lot of times it would just be, you know, he'd be driving me somewhere and off to a rally, and he'd point to something, you know, he'd say, you see those trees over there? That's a shelter belt. And back in the Dust Bowl, farmers were going broke, and Franklin Roosevelt came in and changed all that with the New Deal. And that's the way he would talk to us about public policy. It always had a story behind it and how it would help people. And he once said, being in politics is the best profession because you can either do the most good for people or do the most harm. And it's obvious which one he chose to go to. But for him, it was always about helping people, and there was always a story behind it. And I remember one time, you know, it was 1980, I was 8 years old, and we'd go down to the campaign office and help stuff envelopes and things like that and just help out any way we could. And one day he came to the office, and he kind of had a smile on his face like he was about to get away with something. And he said, "Hey, Matthew, you want to go on an airplane?" And that's why I said, "Yeah, of course." And someone drove us down to the airport, and we got a single-engine plane in Mitchell and flew off to somewhere West River. I don't know where we were, but it was just me and him, and it was just a big adventure. And he made it a lot of fun for us. And I see a little look of horror in my mom's face at us being in a small airplane like that with the safety record they have. But he wanted it to be fun for us. And I remember another night we were going to go to a lutefisk dinner, which it's made out of whitefish, and for kids especially, I don't think it tastes that great. So he wanted to make the campaign fun for us, and he dropped Tim, Kevin, and me, and I think Sam, he dropped us off at an A&W nearby with a $20 bill. And so we just loaded up on chili dogs and onion rings and root beer floats. And then we spent every last penny we could in the little vending machines that dispense candy and toys. And that was a lot of fun for us. Probably not so much for everyone else on the campaign that night, but it was a lot of fun for us. And he tried to make things fun for us. And as I got older, he took us to Disney World a couple times, and I made just an offhand remark about saying, hey, the space shuttle is going to launch soon. We should go see it. And this was the second space shuttle launch in the early 80s, and he made that happen for us. And I guess he had a little bit of pull, but he was going to use it to spoil his grandkids, in addition to all the great things that he's done that all the other speakers touched on earlier. And he continued to do that throughout our lives as we got older. He had that common sense that's really hard to argue with, and that great sense of humor that he always had. And one time in my I guess I was about 28, and I was thinking about deciding whether or not to go to law school, and he was saying I should go, as any grandparent would probably tell their grandchild. And I said, but Grandpa, when I'm done, I'll be 32 years old. And he said, Matthew, you're going to turn 32 no matter what. Do you want to be 32 with a law degree or not? And it's just, he just had that kind of common sense. It's hard to argue with. And so I went to law school, and I was fortunate enough to, when I finished law school, I came here to South Dakota, and it was great to be able to spend more time with Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa George, both as an adult, and kind of realizing that they're getting older and no one lives forever. So I was lucky enough, and some of my favorite things would be driving him places, because he needed rides, and I was always happy to oblige. Some of those 5 a.m. trips to the airport weren't a lot of fun, but I don't complain about them now. And I remember one time, this is just maybe this summer, actually, we were driving from Mitchell to Sioux Falls, and it was late at night, completely dark out, and we were kind of near Salem. And he kind of looked out the window and he said, "Look out there." And that's thinking, look at what? And he said, "Look at all the lights out there." When I was a kid, there weren't any lights once you got outside of town. And Franklin Roosevelt changed that and brought us the REAs. And again, he's talking about policy and being involved in politics as a way to help people and bring lights to places where there weren't any. And it's hard to imagine today, but it wasn't that. I mean, he remembered the day when there wasn't any electricity or lights out in rural areas in South Dakota, and he wasn't shy about having public policy come in and fix that. And one last story about driving this is maybe, I think 2 winters ago, we had that really just bitterly cold winter, and he decided he wanted to go back to Mitchell, and it was sometime in January. And those of you in South Dakota, when you get out on the interstate in the winter, that wind just blows your car from the side, and my little car especially feels like it can just blow into the ditch, and there's blowing snow and ice, and the interstate wasn't closed, but it was a travel advisory advising saying don't do any non-essential travel. But my grandpa wanted to go to Mitchell, so I was going to drive him to Mitchell, and got out on the interstate, and the car was just blowing to the side, and I said something like, "Yeah, this weather is just terrible today." And he was never one to brag about his service in World War II, ever, except this one time where he said, he was a great storyteller. It's one reason he was so successful in politics, and sometimes he would slow it down a little bit to make a point, and you had to listen. And so he started talking real slow, and he said, "Matthew, when I was in the war, a lot of times we had to fly in bad weather, and you'd get out there behind the cockpit, and you've got 20,000 pounds of bombs in the plane, and another 20,000 pounds of fuel, and a whole crew of people, and the weather's so bad you can't even see the end of the runway, but you just had to go." And that was the end of his story. And so I thought, well, I guess I'm not going to complain about the weather anymore, because he's been through much worse. So I'm just going to wrap it up there, and if there's anyone else from the family that wants to tell some more stories, or Scott or anyone else who's next.
thank you all very much. And before we have another song and then a benediction, I wanted to just announce that the doors will open at the Mary Summervold Hall of the Pavilion at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. The service will be at 1 p.m. and then there will be refreshments on the second floor at 2 p.m. and you're all invited, and we look forward to seeing you all there. So one more song from East of Westreville.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. In the shadow of the steeple, by the relief office, I saw my people as they stood there hungry. I stood there wondering
As I was walking, I saw a sign there, and on that sign it said, no trespassing. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. This land is your land. Come on, this land is my land. California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me. One more time. This land is your land. This land is my land. California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.
Funeral services